Thank you, Chairman Allen, and thank you, Commissioners, for allowing us to come in today and talk to you a little bit. This is a presentation on some work that we've been doing with the Center for Island Climate Adaptation and Policy at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. And we've had the opportunity to take our work, which I think you're getting a copy of, a white paper we published. We've taken our work out on the road and we've presented this and done a host of workshops and discussions with people from sort of all walks of the water community. And so what I'd like to do today is to give you a condensed briefing on some of our findings, and then more importantly talk to you about what some of the things we're hearing as feedback are coming back to us. So I'd like to start with figuring out how to make PowerPoint work. There we go. Start with two quotes that, there's lots of talk about climate change in various contexts in Hawaii and elsewhere, but two quotes that I pulled out of various things in the public record from recent years, 2008 and 2011, just underscoring that people in positions of power, people like the commissioners on the Water Commission, people like Governor Abercrombie, recognize that water resources are important, no kidding, and also that climate change is one of the factors that we have to think about when we're thinking about stewarding our water resources for the future. So we have this commission saying that it's prudent to consider the long-term effects of climate change. Back in 2008, that's ahead of the curve. Climate change, the discussion is heating up in recent years. And we have the more recent statement by the governor that protecting water is the highest priority for public leaders like yourselves. The work we've done at ICAP, the abbreviation, I'm sure you're tired of acronyms, but I'll use ICAP as a short name. The work we've done at ICAP focuses on law and policy and the concept of climate change adaptation. I'll describe what I mean by the phrase adaptation in just a minute, but I'll start with why would we want to adapt to climate change in the first place? So I've got two charts here to visually give us the picture. On the left is one I'm sure you've all seen before. It's Delwyn Oakey's work back in 2004, analyzing the long-term trends in stream flow across the state of Hawaii. And of course, Delwyn found on every island there's a decline in stream flow. And you can see that trend. This is a trend going back to 1910. So that's 2004. Let's jump up now to about a week ago and some work from Dr. Richard Muller, who was labeled as a climate change skeptic on the mainland in California. And he was given some money by other climate change skeptics to go back and reanalyze the data and see if temperature as a proxy for climate change is in fact accurate. Does our record of temperature going back now at least hundreds of years, probably thousands of years, and even millions of years, does it corroborate the concept of climate change? So this chart on the right, it really is only about a week and a half old, and this shows the results of their work. They've basically thrown out all of the data that they think is bad, and Dr. Muller's changed his mind. He no longer thinks that temperature records are problematic. You can see that as you get further and further towards the current time in 2000, that everybody's measurements of temperature have converged, and we see from about 1965, 1970 onward, a pretty alarming rise in global temperature. Of course, that's not what's happening here in Hawaii. There's lots of good science happening in Hawaii. And the concept of adaptation then is, how do people like you take the scientific work that's being done at UH and other places, and how do you use that to make sensible choices when you're taking care of our water resources? So our work started with combing through literature in all contexts, not just water contexts, but environmental issues of all types, and figuring out what are the common threads for climate change adaptation. What sorts of things are the experts saying are good when you want to be adaptive to a climate? And we found four characteristics. The first is people say you should focus on being forward-looking. And this is pretty obvious. In fact, I'll skip back to our back slide. If we make decisions about things based on what temperatures were like between 1900 and 1950, we are making decisions based on a record that doesn't reflect what's happening in 2012. And the same goes for temperature as it does for water. So the forward-looking characteristic is pretty obvious. The second characteristic is flexibility. This is the concept that there's uncertainty out there. Things are going to change. The science is going to get better. Are we implementing policies and laws that are flexible enough to adapt immediately, and that we don't have to go through a 25-year birthing period to revise the water code before we can adapt to these changes as they come up? The third characteristic is the concept of being integrated. This is the idea that climate change doesn't just affect water resources, and it doesn't just affect water resources in one way. So an integrated approach means you're looking at the system holistically and thinking about it holistically. And then the fourth characteristic is the concept of being iterative, and this means that adaptation really means a constant cycle of monitoring the resource, monitoring how we're using it, monitoring the decisions that are being made, and then using that information as a feedback loop into the decision-making process. So those are our four adaptive characteristics. The next step of our work then was to figure out, okay, what is this legal law and policy framework for regulating water in Hawaii, and asking whether or not those four adaptive characteristics turn up. And so we conceptualized that framework, that legal framework, as this chart you see now. We've got our Hawaii Constitution. Water is the only natural resource that has specific protection within the text of the Constitution. The public trust doctrine that I'm sure you're all familiar with, the precautionary principle. And then getting down to the nuts and bolts, we've got our water code. I'm a huge fan of the water code, as might come across during this briefing. The Water Commission is you're the hammer of the water code. I think you all know that. But that's not where things actually get done. I mean, if we think about, okay, you make decisions, but where do water resources really get used, and where do these decisions really get made? And then we've got this whole host of sort of an implementation phase at the bottom of our framework there. And I've given just some examples of the people and places that those things happen. I can happily report that you see those adaptive characteristics turning up again and again and again within the framework. So I've just put up 4 examples. There are lots more in the documents that were handed out to you. But the Constitution, as I mentioned, has got a mandate to protect water resources for present and future generations. There's our forward-looking characteristic. We can skip down 2 boxes. The public trust doctrine, the Hawaii Supreme Court, in describing the public trust doctrine, has explained that it must conform to changing needs and conditions. There's our flexibility characteristic. And then at our implementation level, the Water Code, Water Commission, and another level, we see things like the statutory mandate for a continuing study of saltwater intrusion. So there's an example of the iterative approach. These things turn up in lots and lots of places. But the question now then is, okay, we've got these mandates. How do you implement them? What are the tools that you can use to implement them? And the latter half of our work was in identifying 12 specific tools that are that already exist within our law and policy framework, but which could be used either more or could be used better as adaptive tools for climate change as we move forward. So our 12 tools are split up into 3 categories. The first category is the policy and planning side of things. We've identified 5 tools. I mentioned that we've already done some workshops. We've gotten feedback. So I'll focus just on 3 of these planning tools. The first 3 you see there. The other 2 are also important. I'll mention them briefly. We feel that the Oahu model of the water use and development planning process, where we take the individual watershed management plans and together they comprise the single water use and development plan, we see that as an integrative approach that is adaptive. The 5th one, conservation and recycling plans, I mean, that's a way to increase flexibility, to be forward-looking in the way we're using water, and I'm certain it's already on the top of your minds that that's something that's important for the state to think about and to implement. Going back to the 3 planning tools that we've received some good feedback about, climate scenario planning is the first one. If we go through the water use and development plans that are either have recently been updated or in the process of being updated, or we look at other parts of the Hawaii Water Plan, we see that there's a dearth of climate change planning in there. That's to be expected. I mean, a lot of this was drafted before the most recent IPCC climate change report, so it's not completely unexpected, but nonetheless, there isn't a whole lot going on with climate change in those plans. And we can look to places like California, which have a similar planning model, and where adaptation and climate change has jumped right to the front of the line in terms of importance of things to plan for. On the left, I've got an example. They actually have a specific plan for adaptation, so it's separate and apart from the remaining water plan. On the right, I've posted just one excerpt from the actual whole California water plan, and this shows the way that they're doing climate scenario planning. They came up with 12 climate projections based on science that have been done for California. And then they use those climate projections to help them build scenarios based on economic development and land use and other metrics that we're familiar with in the planning process. And so they've just injected climate change as one more way of projecting out how our plans will impact future water resources. I empathize that trying to devise 12 climate scenarios for Hawaii is difficult. It's the sort of thing that the scientists are still working on. But we think that maybe there's a starting point, something like 3 scenarios, a worst case scenario, a best case scenario, and a middle of the road scenario. And then just incorporating those projections into the analysis in all parts of the Hawaii Water Plan. So climate scenario planning, one tool that could be implemented a little further in our current planning process. The second tool on our list, updating all the components of the water plan frequently. This is something I'm sure you're familiar with. We'll start on the right of this slide. There are components of the current Hawaii Water Plan that haven't been updated in over 20 years. The Commission back in 2000 suggested or demanded that updates should be done every 5 years. And so sorting out a way to implement that, to make that actually happen, that's inherently adaptive. That's this constant iterative approach that we've talked about, being flexible. But there has to be a way to make it work. One of the concerns that I've read about, but I actually haven't heard too much about in our comments recently, is that it's expensive. It's expensive to create a water use and development plan. It's expensive to put together the water resource protection plan. But I think that the Commission hit the nail on the head back in 2000 by pointing out that when you take this iterative approach, when you are updating something every couple of years, you're not starting from scratch. You're not devising the whole 300 pages of the water resource protection plan and drafting it. Instead, you're taking something that was done just a few years ago, you're reanalyzing things like the land use projections, the climate projections, and you're just changing those pieces or updating those pieces that need to be updated. I think that's actually a more cost-effective approach than redrafting it every 15 or 20 years. And I think that a lot of other people agree with that, including the folks in California who are doing exactly that. They're updating their plan every 4 to 5 years. I've just put as an example, they've got their timeline for updating the plan already posted. It'll be updated again in 2013. Their most recent update was in 2009. So our second tool, adaptive tool, is updating the plan regularly. And then our third planning and policy tool, this isn't necessarily what we think of as a water task, but land use planning. I mean, one explicit requirement of the county water use and development plans is that they analyze land use, project it in the future, and try to understand how that impacts water demand and water supply. So I dug into the Hawaii County Water Use and Development Plan, and I had a look at, well, what are the projections for land use planning? And it turns out the yellow and red bars here are the water demand scenarios that they've predicted if the land use plans, the zoning plan or the general plan, are fully built out. So this is the maximum projected water demand. The blue line, the blue bar and the blue line, is the sustainable yield for those same aquifers. And we see in every case that the anticipated demand, if we meet our land use planning goals or our land use planning benchmarks, exceeds the sustainable yield. So it's great. It's great that we're doing the planning. That's important. But the next question becomes, okay, what do you do with this information once it comes out of the plan? You can't just sit in a plan somewhere and not do anything with it. I'd also like to point out that this illustrates the need for regular updating. One of the Water Commission staff members, I think, really smartly pointed out that the full build-out scenarios here have huge uncertainties because of uncertainty about the agricultural water demand. And so the reason there's still that uncertainty is that our agricultural water use and development plan needs some updating, and that would help to constrain this a little bit better, would give us better information in our planning process. So answering that question of what do you do or what does one do when these land use plans don't quite match up with our water resource planning, one model from here in Hawaii is the Maui Water Availability Policy, the concept that subdivisions have to prove that they've got a long-term reliable supply of water before subdivision approval, or actually as a first step to subdivision approval. We think this is inherently adaptive, right? This is forward-looking. The bad news is, you probably know, back in April, there's the county council in Maui defanged a bit this water availability policy. And I'm not sure in making that decision if people were thinking about it as a climate tool. I mean, was that part of the analysis or not part of the analysis? And if it was part of the analysis, would people have changed their thinking on it? On to our next category of tools. We identified 4 regulatory tools that I think the people in this room are intimately familiar with. Again, I'll just talk about 2 of them quickly. The other 2, labeled as 7 and 8 here, Expanding designated water management areas, we think that's an adaptive tool because it inherently enables flexibility, inherently enables monitoring. There's quite a long list of things that you can do in designated water management areas that you can't quite do in the non-designated areas. Enforcing water use monitoring and reporting, I'm happy to report that based on my talks, it looks like there's a lot of work on this front within the Water Commission staff and other places in the state already. It doesn't mean we don't have to pay attention to it, but I just won't focus on it too much today. Instead, the two regulatory tools that we'll look at, the primary benchmarks in water planning and water regulation are the concepts of sustainable yield and in-stream flow standards. And a lot of the work in other places has looked at this and questioned whether or not that's a climate adaptive benchmark. Too often, the concept of sustainable yield is thought of as a maximum sustainable yield. And climate experts suggest the other way to frame this, and the smarter way to frame this, is as a clearly sustainable yield. So making sure that there's a buffer in there for climate uncertainties, which you have to do your climate scenario planning before you can do that piece. So we see why this regulation follows the planning. An example of where this hasn't quite hit the mark here in Hawaii, again looking at Maui, the Maui Water Use and Development Plan notes that some of their analyses, their stream flow analyses, are based on historical stream flows. And we know from looking at that 2004 trend that if you're basing your analysis on historical flows, you're not quite predicting where things are going to be in the future. But the folks on Maui aren't forgetting about the climate change issue, and so there's a note here that they aren't taking into account things like anticipated climate change. And you could revise the analysis based on specific assumptions. So again, if we make some climate scenario planning assumptions, it allows our regulatory tools to become that much more adaptive and effective. The concept of permitting, a lot of what the Water Commission does is revolves around permitting. And so are there ways to make the permitting process more adaptive? And it doesn't have to just be the water use permit. It can be well permits, stream diversion permits, all sorts of permits out there could be more adaptive. Could we make compliance, monitoring compliance, part of this permit process? Is there a way to build in at the beginning maybe an inspection, a regular inspection to make sure people are in compliance for their monitoring their water use? Or is there a way to implement maybe a monitoring and compliance consortium where people pay a fee towards a larger group that makes sure that everybody is in compliance with their permits? Are there ways, and we've suggested some in the white paper, are there ways to make it into more of a living permit model where permits aren't just issued and forgotten about until there's some problem or some tussle about the water, but instead there's a regular process for going back and making sure that the permit still makes sense based on what we know about water resources today? Another thing that I think you probably all have seen shows the decline in the number of continuous flow stream gauges over time. And from mid-1960s onward, we see this precipitous decline in the number of gauges around the state. So is there a way to use a permit to bolster that monitoring regime? Can we require people, or can we require groups of people in particular geographic areas who have permits, want permits, and want to keep their permits to be monitoring these sorts of important things that don't necessarily come from their individual water use, but nonetheless are related to their water use? Deep monitor wells, which are lacking in some parts of the state, are particularly a thorny problem here because a deep monitor well obviously doesn't interact with just one particular permitted source of water. But nonetheless, you might think about the consortium approach again as a way to fund deep monitoring wells. And I'll talk a little bit more about this at the end. I'd also like to, this came to me in the middle of the night last night, so I apologize if the thought is a little bit scattered, but it occurred to me that this graph of stream gauges around the state and this graph of decadal temperature changes around the Earth, there's an important analog between the two. We see that our monitoring capabilities start to drop off in about 1970. If we look at the temperature changes, we see that the temperature changes start to really ramp up around 1970. That's the opposite of adaptation, right? We have something we need to think about, we need to adapt to, and all of a sudden our ability to do it has really dropped off. So I thought that was just something to think about in the mix of all of this. Our third category of tools, market-based tools, are the ways to use the market to help us be more adaptive. This is obviously tricky. We have protected uses of water here in the state. We can't follow the models of places like Colorado or other states for these market-based tools. But nonetheless, there's a way to use market forces to help us be more adaptive in our water use and our water supply. And I'll talk about all three, but I'll combine two of them and I'll change the order. So forget this slide for a moment. Let's start with the concept of water commission fees. The current regime is there's essentially a flat fee for anybody who walks in the door and seeks to get a permit. And that's not really adaptive. That's not an iterative approach because there are some permits that just require more work, more regulatory work, more planning work, more monitoring work than other types of permits or other specific permits. So is there a way to change this water commission fee schedule such that you have tiered fees where the cost of protecting the resource and making sure that the permit holders can continue to use the resource into the future is tied into the cost of obtaining the permit? And there are other examples in our state rules and regulations where they're starting to implement these things. There are obviously some, there are growing pains, and anytime you try to impose fees like this, but if it's tied directly into protecting the water resource for the people who are getting the permits, it seems to me a natural marriage between two concepts. And then finally, combining the last of the two tools on our list, is there a way to use market forces? Is there a way to use the market to promote water-conscious infrastructure, promoting the flexibility and the iterative characteristics that climate change adaptation demands? And so the model here that I'd like to suggest might be applicable is the model we've chosen in the state for energy. In the energy regime, we have a public benefits fee that all ratepayers, at least all ratepayers under the HECO umbrella, have to pay. That money goes to the public benefits fee administrator, what we know as the Hawaii Energy Program. And then it's Hawaii Energy's job to take the money and to reduce energy consumption around the state. We've had similar efforts like this, piecemeal in the water regime. I mean, there are the toilet rebates, for example, that were very successful in getting people to adopt low-flow toilets. But to sort of up the stakes a little bit, to make further inroads in that conservation, recycling, efficiency world, I'm not sure that the piecemeal approach is going to work. And the Hawaii Energy Program has a menu of ways that they're using rebates and other sorts of incentives to shift the market for water-conscious infrastructure. I came across this slide on the right, and I thought it was interesting, not because it's green in the sense that it's they're advertising this particular laundry machine, which is a high-volume commercial laundry machine. Not that it's green in the sense of being environmentally sound, but green in the sense that it pays for itself. And they advertise it pays for itself in something like 18 months. The anecdotes that I've read from Las Vegas suggest that that's exactly right. And so I wonder, is there a way to use a public benefits fee system to get that sort of larger infrastructure in place here in Hawaii? And of course, you don't have to just focus on that large infrastructure. I mean, another thing that occurs to me when I'm looking at this model is that we get our water bills that show our water consumption once a month. And if I was going to the grocery store once a week, but I just saw the bill once a month, I wouldn't have any idea how I was spending my money, where I could save some money, if I was really buying my groceries efficiently and effectively. So you could use this public benefits fee fund maybe to revamp the way that people monitor their water use. Could there be an in-home display or a web portal or an iPhone app that allows people to see exactly how they're using their water, to catch their leaks more quickly, to be more careful about the way we use our sprinklers and those sorts of things. So I hope I haven't rushed through too much. I wanted to be respectful of your time and kind of just give you the briefest synopsis I could. How do we take all of these principles, these concepts, these things that I've thrown at you at the top of the slide, and how do we make them happen? And I think that the great news is we have in this state a set of people who have the power to do exactly that. If we decide that climate change and all the other issues affecting water resources are important enough, the Water Commission, and this is the language of the Hawaii Supreme Court, is empowered to protect and advance our rights to that water for future generations, the Constitution says, at every stage of the planning and decision-making process. So I'd just like to leave you with the concept that as water commissioners, you can be champions of climate change adaptation, and you can help to satisfy that mandate for protecting our water resources. Thanks a lot, and if you've got any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Any questions?
First of all, I want to thank you for this work and the presentation here and around the state. I think this is really helpful and really glad to have it and wish to encourage you to keep doing it. A lot of the concepts you outline, I think, are very, very consistent with, certainly our water code and constitution and the thinking that I've seen on this commission and with this staff. A lot of the trouble in doing that and being proactive comes from being able to fund it. And it sounded to me like you were hinting at moving toward, to a way of having a, some kind of water fee or some kind of, whether it's on the time of permitting or it's ongoing. I was wondering if you could just share a little more thinking, because I'm not really clear what you were suggesting and moving toward.
Certainly. So I'll start with, I wasn't entirely clear because we haven't reached that step in this analysis of specifically what's the rule to pass to make sure all this stuff gets paid for. And that's the purpose of going out and talking to people. And I think we're getting much nearer to that stage. I think my answer is that this is an example of where the integrated approach makes sense. Asking ratepayers to fund monitoring for every water user in the state probably doesn't work. So a public goods fee can't bear that entire cost. There would be too much backlash, and it would be systematically unfair. At the same time, it doesn't make sense to have just permit holders pay that same amount either. So I think that my suggestion is that examining at which steps along the way there's an opportunity for either fees or for efficiencies, saving money because you're not pumping as much water, should free up some money to do the sorts of monitoring that we're suggesting are important. So this integrated approach of kind of a menu of things that might together make up that difference is the approach that we think makes sense.
And resource protection would fall under that as well, or is that a separate area?
It's hard for me to split out resource protection from other. Is monitoring a resource protection function? It is, and it isn't. It's also a regulatory function. So I think that you naturally have to bring it all under one umbrella and make sure that the equity is balanced. Across the state of Hawaii. And of course, Delwyn found on every island there's a decline in stream flow. And this is, you can see that trend. This is a trend going back to 1910. So that's 2004. Let's jump up now to about a week ago and some work from Dr. Richard Muller, who actually he was labeled as a climate change skeptic on the mainland in California. And he was given some money by other climate change skeptics to go back and reanalyze the data and see if temperature as a proxy for climate change is in fact accurate. Does our record of temperature going back now at least hundreds of years, probably thousands of years, and even millions of years, does it corroborate the concept of climate change? So this chart on the right, it really is only about a week and a half old, and this shows the results of their work. They've basically thrown out all of the things we're hearing as feedback are coming back to us. So I'd like to start with figuring out how to make PowerPoint work. There we go. Start with two quotes that, there's lots of talk about climate change in various contexts in Hawaii and elsewhere, but two quotes that I pulled out of various things in the public record from recent years, 2008 and 2011, just underscoring that people in positions of power, people like the commissioners on the Water Commission, people like Governor Abercrombie recognize that water resources are important, no kidding, and also that climate change is one of the factors that we have to think about when we're thinking about stewarding our water resources for the future. So we have this commission saying that it's prudent to consider the long-term effects of the data that they think is bad, and Dr. Muller's changed his mind. He no longer thinks that temperature records are problematic. You can see that as you get further and further towards the current time in 2000, that everybody's measurements of temperature have converged, and we see from about 1965, 1970 onward, a pretty alarming rise in global temperature. Of course, that's not what's happening here in Hawaii. There's lots of good science happening in Hawaii. And the concept of adaptation then is, how do people like you take the scientific work that's being done at UH and other places, and how do you use that to make sensible choices when you're taking care of our water resources? So our work started with combing through literature in all contexts, not just water contexts, but environmental issues of all types, and figuring out what are the climate change. Back in 2008, I mean, that's ahead of the curve. Climate change, the discussion is heating up in recent years. And we have the more recent statement by the governor that protecting water is the highest priority for public leaders like yourselves. The work we've done at ICAP, the abbreviation, I'm sure you're tired of acronyms, but I'll use ICAP as a short name. The work we've done at ICAP focuses on law and policy and the concept of climate change adaptation. I'll describe what I mean by the phrase adaptation in just a minute, but I'll start with why would we want to adapt to climate change in the first place? So I've got two charts here to visually give us the picture. On the left is one I'm sure you've all seen before. It's Delwyn Oakey's work back in 2004, analyzing the long-term trends in stream flow across. Thank you, Chairman Allen, and thank you, Commissioners, for allowing us to come in today and talk to you a little bit. This is a presentation on some work that we've been doing with the Center for Island Climate Adaptation and Policy at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. And we've had the opportunity to take our work, which I think you're getting a copy of, a white paper we published. We've taken our work out on the road, and we've presented this and done a host of workshops and discussions with people from sort of all walks of the water community. And so what I'd like to do today is to give you a condensed briefing on some of our findings, and then more importantly, talk to you about what some of the things